I need to check the name list carefully before writing. The names to avoid: Rachel, Daniel, Biscuit, Claire, Marcus, Simone, James, Lydia, Ren, Ivy, Gloria, Lauren, Owen, Patrick, Carver, Theo, Brianna, Petra, Nora, Faye, Aldous, Dale, Melissa, Garrett, Deborah, Carol, August, Margot, Brennan, Marin, Holden, Coralie, Wyatt, Verity, Mrs. Porty, Mrs. Bogg, Hagen, Margaret Carey, Mrs. Halverson, Eleanor. New names I'll use: Audrey, narrator; Colton, brother; Sasha, brother's girlfriend; dad/mom by relationship. The day I found out I wasn't on the guest list, I was standing in the middle of a Whole Foods parking lot, holding a bag of groceries I'd bought for my mother. She'd called me that morning, the way she always did when she needed something, voice bright, words soft, the kind of warmth that only appeared when she was about to ask. She needed almond milk, the kind with no sugar. She needed lemons. She needed the good crackers, not the ones from the regular store. I didn't think twice. I was already out. I grabbed everything she asked for. I was halfway to their house when my phone buzzed with a text from my sister-in-law to be. Sasha. She was marrying my brother Colton in 6 weeks. The text said, "Hey, just wanted to make sure you got the note my mom sent about the seating." I hadn't gotten any note. I told her that. She went quiet for a second, then, "Oh, I think there might have been some confusion. Let me check with Colton." She didn't call back that day. Colton didn't either. My mother was the one who finally said it, 3 days later, sitting across from me at her kitchen table with her hands folded in her lap like she was bracing for impact. She'd made tea. She hadn't offered me any. "The venue has a strict capacity," she said. I waited. And Sasha's family is very large. They have a lot of cousins. I kept waiting. Colton thought it might be easier if you just came to the reception dinner, not the ceremony itself. I remember looking down at the table. There was a small stain near the edge, something old, something none of them had bothered to clean. I'd refinished that table 4 years ago, sanded it down to bare wood on a Saturday in November, when my mother said it was looking worn. I did it in their garage, spent 6 hours on it. "The ceremony is family only?" I said. My mother looked at her hands. "It's just the numbers." "I'm family," I said. She didn't answer that. Here's the thing about being the one who handles things. Nobody notices until you stop. I am 31 years old. I have a master's degree in structural engineering. I have been employed without a single gap since I was 19, first part-time through college, then full-time the moment I graduated. I have never once asked my parents for money as an adult. Not once. My brother Colton is 27. He has a communications degree he finished in 6 years. He has worked in the time since graduation, a series of jobs that lasted between 4 and 11 months each. He is charming. He is my mother's favorite. She has never said this out loud, but she has also never had to. For the last 4 years, I had been what my family called reliable. What that meant in practice, I covered the security deposit when my parents moved to a smaller apartment after my father's hours got cut. I paid for my grandmother's cremation when she passed because no one else had the money and there wasn't time to argue. I co-signed a car loan for my brother when no one else would because he needed the car for a new job, and the job seemed real this time. I flew home 4 times in 1 year when my father was having health issues and my mother said she couldn't manage alone. None of this was ever discussed as a transaction. That's the thing about families like mine. It's never framed as you owe us or we need you to pay. It's framed as you're the capable one and we're so grateful and we don't know what we'd do without you. And you believe it. For a long time, you believe it is love. It took being cut from my brother's wedding ceremony to understand that it was not love. It was logistics. I was useful, and useful things get used. I didn't cry when my mother told me. I want to be honest about that. I didn't cry because I wasn't shocked. I was something quieter than shocked. I was tired in a way I hadn't had language for until that moment. Sitting in that kitchen, looking at that stain on the table I had refinished with my own 2 hands. I drove home. I sat in my apartment. I made myself dinner. I did not call to yell. I did not send a long text. I did not, and I want to be clear about this, make a scene. What I did was open my laptop and pull up the loan documents I had signed for my brother's car. The cosign agreement had a clause. I'd read it carefully at the time, because I always read things carefully. It is one of the ways I am reliable that allowed the cosigner to formally request removal from the agreement after 12 months of on-time payments, provided the primary borrower met the credit threshold. Colton had made 14 on-time payments. He had, apparently, managed to do that much consistently. I submitted the paperwork to be removed as cosigner. I did it quietly on a Tuesday night while the television was on low in the background. I didn't tell anyone. Then I went to sleep. The wedding was on a Saturday in April. I know this because I watched the weather app that morning the way you sometimes watch things you're not part of. From a distance, clinically, like reading news from a country you once lived in. It was 64 degrees, partly cloudy, a nice day as April days go. I had been told through my mother that I was welcome at the reception dinner starting at 7. The ceremony was at 2. The family photos were at 4. The cocktail hour was at 5:30. I was welcome at 7. I spent the morning doing laundry. I cleaned my bathroom. I went for a run along the path by the river, and I thought about nothing in particular, or I tried to, though there's a specific kind of loneliness that follows you on runs like that. The kind that isn't loud enough to call grief, but sits in your chest the whole time. At noon, my phone buzzed. It was Sasha. Hey, I just want you to know I didn't know about this until recently. I'm really sorry. I should have called sooner. I've been thinking about you all morning. I stared at the message for a long time. Thank you, I wrote back. I hope today is beautiful for you. I meant it. I actually meant it. Sasha had never been unkind to me. Sasha, I suspected, had not been entirely in control of her own guest list. She sent back a heart. Then nothing else. I ate lunch. I watched something on television. I can't now remember. At 5 o'clock I started getting dressed, because I had decided, and I want to be clear that this was a decision, not a default, that I would go to the reception dinner, not because I wanted to perform normalcy, not because I was pretending this was fine, but because not showing up felt like disappearing and I refused to disappear on their terms. I would show up. I would be gracious. I would let them see, clearly, that I was not broken. The reception hall was in a converted mill building outside the city. Exposed brick, Edison bulbs, the kind of venue that costs more than people admit. I knew how much it cost because my mother had mentioned the number to me in passing 8 months ago, when the booking deposit was due and Colton didn't have it. She hadn't asked me directly. She'd mentioned the number and the date and then said I just don't know how they're going to manage it in that tone she had, and then waited. I had written the check. I walked in at 7:15. The dinner was already underway. Long tables, candles, the remnants of a first course. My mother saw me from across the room and waved with a brightness that looked like relief. My father nodded. Colton was at the head table with Sasha and her family and a row of people I didn't recognize. He didn't look up when I walked in. I found my seat. I was at table 9, which I noted was not near the family, but near a cluster of people who turned out to be Sasha's coworkers, which was actually fine. They were genuinely interesting. A woman named, I'll call her Kay, who worked in urban planning and told a story about a zoning dispute that was funnier than it had any right to be. I drank exactly 2 glasses of wine. I ate the salmon. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. At one point, my mother came over and squeezed my shoulder and said quietly, "You look beautiful. I'm glad you came." I said, "Of course." That was all. Near the end of the night, Colton came to my table. He crouched down next to my chair, which was the posture of someone trying to seem humble without actually being humble. "I know this is weird," he said. "It's fine," I said. "Sasha's family, Colton," I said. "It's fine," he nodded, relieved, because he'd wanted absolution and I'd given him something that sounded like it, and that was enough for him. He went back to his table. I watched him go. He put his arm around Sasha and she leaned into him and they looked happy, genuinely happy, and something in me was glad for her even while the rest of me sat very still with the knowledge that the word fine had become the thing I said when I had run out of anything honest to offer. I drove home alone that night. My apartment was quiet. I poured a glass of water and sat by the window and didn't turn on any lights for a while. The city outside was doing what cities do, moving, lit up, indifferent. I sat there and let myself feel what I actually felt, which was not rage, not exactly, but something that had been building for years and had finally, that night, finished building, like a structure reaching load capacity. I know how that works. It is not dramatic. The thing simply becomes full, and then it can take nothing more. I thought about the table I refinished. I thought about the security deposit, the cremation, the car loan, the 4 plane tickets in 1 year. I thought about the almond milk I'd bought 2 months ago and left on their counter and no one ever mentioned again. I thought about how none of it had ever been enough to earn me a seat at the ceremony. And I thought, sitting there in the dark, that I was done trying to earn it. 3 weeks later, my mother called. She was upset, voice thin, the way it got when something had disrupted her sense of how things were supposed to go. Colton had gotten the letter from the bank. Something about the cosign removal. Something about how his credit profile had been updated and his interest rate was being renegotiated, and could I please explain what I had done? I removed myself from the cosign agreement, I said. I was eligible after 12 months. I submitted the paperwork. Silence. Audrey. My mother's voice had that particular weight it carried when she believed she was being wronged. That is going to affect his monthly payment. I know, I said. You didn't tell anyone. I wasn't required to. Why would you do that? And here's the part I had thought about in the 3 weeks between the reception dinner and this phone call. I had thought about what I would say when this moment came. I had drafted long explanations in my head, detailed and careful, laying out every instance, every check, every airport pickup, every time I had been the one who showed up and the one who was, ultimately, not counted. But sitting there on the phone, I found I didn't want to deliver a speech. I said because I needed to make a change, and that was the one I could make. That's not an explanation, I know. Another silence. Longer this time. Your brother is very stressed right now, she said. He's trying to build his life. I know he is, I said. I hope he does. I don't understand why you're being like this. And I thought about explaining what this was. The table. The deposit. The ceremony. Table 9. The shoulder squeeze. I'm glad you came. But I also understood in that moment that explaining would require her to be capable of hearing, and I was no longer certain she was. Not because she was cruel. My mother is not a cruel person. But because she had organized her understanding of our family in a way that made her the one who worried. Colton, the one who was loved, and me, the one who handled it. And reorganizing that would take more than a phone call. It would take her choosing to see something she had spent 31 years not looking at. I wasn't going to force that. I wasn't going to beg for it. I'm not being like anything, I said. I'm just making different choices now. She didn't respond to that. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing, and then we said goodbye. Sasha texted me the following week, not about the cosign. About something else entirely. She'd seen a news article about a bridge renovation project in the city I worked in and thought of me, remembered I'd mentioned working in infrastructure, and sent it with a note, saw this and thought of you. Is this your team? It wasn't my team, but it was the kind of project I'd worked on. I told her that. We ended up texting back and forth for 20 minutes. She asked about my job. I asked about the honeymoon. She said Colton was stressed about some work stuff, but she was trying to help him figure it out. She didn't mention the loan. I didn't either. Before she signed off, she said, "For what it's worth, I want you to know I'm sorry about how the wedding was handled. It wasn't right. I said so at the time, but I didn't say it loudly enough, and I should have." I sat with that for a moment. "Thank you," I wrote. "That means more than you know." I meant that too. My father called me in June. Not my mother, my father, which was unusual. He was not a phone call person. He communicated primarily by nodding and occasionally by grilling things on weekends. He called me on a Tuesday evening and asked if I wanted to have lunch that week. We met at a diner near his work. He ordered the club sandwich. I ordered eggs. We talked about small things for a while. My job, a project he was doing on the house, the weather, which had been strange that spring. Then he set down his coffee and said, "I think we've been hard on you." I looked at him. Not intentionally, he said, but I think, your mother and I, we leaned on you in ways that weren't fair, because you're capable. And that's not a reason. That's just a reason we made up. I didn't say anything for a moment. I don't know if it makes any difference, he said, me saying it now. It does, I said. And then, because it was true, it makes a difference. He nodded. He picked up his sandwich. We didn't talk about it anymore because that is not how my father operates. He says the thing once and considers it said. But I drove home from that lunch feeling something shift. Not fixed, not resolved, but shifted. Like a door that had been stuck for a long time, moved just slightly in its frame. It's been 7 months since the wedding. My brother and I are not close. That is not a dramatic statement. It is just accurate. We text occasionally, mostly surface things. Memes and sports scores and the kinds of updates that keep a thread technically alive. I don't know if we will ever be close. I'm not sure we ever really were, or whether what I'd mistaken for closeness was really just proximity and my own habit of smoothing things over. My mother and I talk. It is still complicated. She is still my mother. I still love her, and the way you love something that was your first understanding of love, even when that understanding turns out to have been incomplete. I have dinner with my parents once a month. I bring things sometimes, not because they ask, but because I want to, and the difference between those two things turns out to matter enormously. What I don't do anymore is fill every gap. What I don't do is co-sign for things I'm not willing to be responsible for. What I don't do is drive to Whole Foods because someone's voice was bright on the phone and mistake warmth when needed for love. That distinction costs something to learn. I won't pretend it doesn't. But I sit in my apartment now, in the evenings, and the quiet here is different from what it used to be. It is not empty. It is not the quiet of waiting for the next phone call, the next need, the next check I'll write, without being asked. It is the quiet of a space that belongs to me, that I have not traded away piece by piece in exchange for belonging somewhere. I belong here. In this life I have built, in this apartment, in this work I am genuinely good at. I am not a security deposit. I am not a co-signer. I am not the capable one who can be relied upon to absorb whatever the family requires. I am a person. And it took being handed a table 9 seat at my brother's wedding, after writing the check for the venue, to finally clearly understand that I had to decide what kind of person I was going to be. Not for them. For me. If you've ever been the one who handled things and found yourself wondering when it became expected instead of appreciated, I see you. I understand that particular exhaustion. Not the kind that comes from working hard, the kind that comes from working hard for people who have stopped noticing that you're working. You are allowed to put it down. You are allowed to decide that capable does not mean available, and that love that only shows up when it needs something is not the kind of love worth organizing your life around. I am still learning what it means to take up space without apologizing for it. I suspect I will be learning for a long time, but I am learning, and that is enough for now. There's a version of this story where I'm the villain. I know that. I removed myself from a co-sign agreement without warning anyone, and that had real consequences for my brother's monthly budget, and I did it quietly on a Tuesday night without so much as a text. I understand how that looks from the outside. But here's what I've come to understand about cause and effect. Not in any cosmic or religious sense, just in the plain human sense. The things we accept without naming them become the things people believe are acceptable. For years, I accepted being the one who handled it. I accepted it so thoroughly, so consistently, so without complaint, that my family stopped seeing it as a choice I was making and started seeing it as simply what I did, who I was, a function, not a person. That's not their fault entirely. I built that. Every time I wrote the check before being asked, every time I said of course when I meant this is hard, every time I smoothed over a difficult moment to keep the peace, I was teaching them who I was, and they learned. What happened at that wedding was the result of years of that lesson being absorbed. Not malice, not hatred, just the quiet, slow calculus of a family that had learned they could count on me so completely that they stopped counting me at all. Colton didn't ban me from his ceremony because he hated me. He did it because, on some level he probably couldn't even articulate, he assumed I would absorb it, the way I always absorbed things. The way capable people are expected to absorb things quietly and keep going. The moment I understood that, I stopped being angry in the way I had been angry. I wasn't wronged by monsters. I was taken for granted by people who'd never had a reason to reckon with what taking me for granted actually cost. And that's on me, partly. Not to punish myself, I spent enough years doing that without realizing it. But to be honest, I had a hand in building the dynamic I eventually had to dismantle. What I learned from Audrey's story, from my own story, is that intelligence without boundaries is just capability being handed to whoever needs it most. I was smart enough to manage every crisis. I was not, for a long time, wise enough to ask whether I should. That's the gap between being good at something and understanding what it's worth. My father said over a club sandwich at a diner, "The capable is not a reason." He meant it as an apology. I received it as something more useful, a principle. Being able to do something does not obligate you to do it indefinitely, for free, in silence, without acknowledgement. That is not virtue. That is erosion. What took courage, real, quiet, unglamorous courage, was not the cosign removal. It was sitting at table 9 with my head up. It was saying, of course, one last time, and meaning something entirely different by it. It was deciding in the dark of my apartment that night that I was going to stop organizing my worth around what I could provide and start understanding it as something I simply had. I am still learning how to do that. It is not a lesson you finish, but it starts with telling the truth about what you've been accepting. And then, slowly, deliberately, accepting something different instead.